The Winter Court was supposed to be a place of sacred reverence, an ancient fortress where the lunar alignment brought the greatest alphas to kneel before the ancestors. Instead, it became the moment Althea Mercer's entire world shattered, though neither she nor her quiet sister knew it yet. For centuries, Frostspire Castle had stood as an impenetrable monolith of black stone and ice, a monument to a rigid werewolf society dominated by fated mate traditions and primal survival. It was a harsh, unforgiving realm that demanded perfection, a place where weakness was not just pitied, but systematically eradicated. The howling winds outside tore at the jagged battlements, carrying the bitter promise of a winter that would not end without a sacrifice. Deep within the lower levels, where the hearth fires barely reached the freezing stone floors, the servants whispered of the changing tides. They spoke of the lunar alignment, a rare celestial convergence that forced the hidden truths of the soul into the blinding light. Evangeline Mercer had spent the entire morning on her hands and knees, scrubbing the grand corridors until her knuckles bled and the icy water numbed her to the bone. She did not mind the cold. The cold was a familiar companion, far kinder than the dismissive sneers of her own flesh and blood. The heavy silver-backed brush scraped through Althea Mercer's golden hair with a rhythmic, hypnotic sound. The preparation chamber of Frostspire Castle was suffocatingly warm, filled with the thick, cloying scent of crushed gardenias and burning beeswax candles. The heat of the massive hearth fire pressed against Evangeline's back, a physical weight that made the rough wool of her scullery dress itch violently against her spine. Yet, beneath the oppressive warmth of the room, a deeper, inexplicable cold had settled into her bones the moment the lunar alignment began in the sky above. It was not the bite of the mountain wind rattling the frosted glass of the narrow windows. It was a strange internal resonance, a hollow ache pulling behind her ribs, warning her that something ancient was waking up in the dark. It felt as though the very stones of the castle were breathing, waiting for a catalyst to ignite the dormant power buried beneath the frost. Evangeline kept her head bowed as she wove the pearl-studded ribbons into her sister's intricate braids. Her calloused, soot-stained fingers moved with practiced, invisible efficiency. She did not complain. She did not beg for a moment's rest, even as the dull throb in her knuckles deepened into a sharp, continuous ache that radiated up her arms. She simply pulled the silk tighter, securing the heavy crown of braids that Althea believed would soon hold a royal diadem. The mirror before them offered a brutal, stark contrast. Althea sat bathed in the golden light of the candelabras, a vision of pampered perfection wrapped in crimson velvet and white fox fur. Her skin was flawless, her lips painted a victorious crimson, her blue eyes sharp with manic, unfiltered ambition. Standing behind her, half swallowed by the shadows, Evangeline looked like a faded charcoal sketch. Her grey dress was frayed at the cuffs, her face smudged with hearth ash, her silver-pale hair tucked severely out of sight. A girl who has never been seen cannot be replaced, because she was never there to begin with. Evangeline had lived by that silent truth for 19 agonizing years. Survival in the Mercer household demanded absolute invisibility. Her mother and father poured every resource, every drop of their fading noble bloodline, into cultivating Althea as the perfect political weapon. Evangeline was the afterthought, the quiet shadow, relegated to scrubbing stone floors and mending torn cloaks, while her sister was trained to seduce kings. They had convinced the entire court that they only had one daughter. Evangeline was merely the unfortunate, wolfless servant who occupied the lowest rung of their household. She remembered the long nights spent shivering in the drafty attic, listening to the muffled sounds of banquets and laughter below. She remembered the sharp sting of her mother's riding crop whenever she dared to step out of the shadows. Over the years, Evangeline had learned to lock her emotions away in a deep, hollow vault, replacing tears with a quiet, unyielding resilience. "Pull it tighter, Evangeline," Althea snapped, her voice breaking the heavy silence of the chamber. She slapped her hand against the vanity table, making the crystal perfume bottles rattle against the polished wood. "Do you want me to look unkempt before the High Council? If this braid falls before the monster of the north arrives, I will have you locked in the cellar for a month with nothing but mouldy bread and freezing water." "It will hold, Althea," she murmured, her voice soft, entirely devoid of the jagged edges that defined her sister's tone. "It had better," Althea sneered, admiring her own reflection, tracing the line of her jaw with a manicured fingernail. "Tonight is the choosing ceremony. The elders will present the Moonlight Ring, and I will be the one to wear it. The other high-born girls are cowards. They tremble at the very mention of Kaelen Sterling." Althea laughed, a high, brittle sound that lacked any genuine warmth. "They call him a beast, a cursed, feral monster who tears through his enemies and freezes the blood of anyone who crosses him. Let them fear him. I do not care if he is a monster. He is the Alpha King of the Winter Court, commander of the largest army in the Northern Territories. Once the relic is on my finger, his power will belong to me, and I will shape this frozen wasteland into an empire of my own design." "The ring must choose you, Althea," Evangeline whispered softly, her veil sight. A rare, dormant cosmic magic buried deep in her blood, pulsing faintly behind her eyes. Sometimes, in the dead of night, when the castle was entirely silent, Evangeline could perceive the hidden, glowing glyphs of history etched into the very stones of the fortress. She could read the spiritual energy left behind by the ancestors, and she knew the world was far more complex than her sister's shallow ambitions. Elder Thorn warned the assembly. "It cannot be forced onto an unworthy hand. Keep your pathetic servant's tongue behind your teeth," she hissed, her beautiful face twisting into a mask of pure, ugly contempt. "You know nothing of magic, Evangeline. You are a defect, a wolfless, useless stain on our family name. The sacred silver belongs to the strongest, the most beautiful, the most worthy. It belongs to me. I will snatch it from that dusty altar before any of those sniveling northern brats can even step forward. The Alpha King will have no choice but to claim me as his Luna." "Get my cloak," Althea commanded, standing up and smoothing the heavy crimson velvet over her hips. "The bells are sounding in the high tower. It is time for me to take my crown." Evangeline draped the thick white fur-lined cloak over her sister's shoulders, fastening the heavy silver clasp at her throat. She followed Althea out of the stifling preparation chamber and into the cavernous, freezing corridors of Frostspire Castle. The transition was brutal. The air in the stone halls was cold enough to make Evangeline's breath plume into thick white clouds. She wrapped her thin arms around her own ribs, shivering as the bitter chill bit through her threadbare grey dress. They descended the grand spiral staircase, joining the throng of elite nobles and pack alphas moving toward the royal sanctuary. The corridors were lined with towering statues of past kings, their stone eyes watching the procession with silent, heavy judgment. Banners of midnight blue and silver fluttered in the freezing drafts, bearing the crest of the ruling pack. No one looked at Evangeline. She was perfectly invisible, a silent shadow trailing behind a radiant, ambitious star. The high-born ladies sneered at the lower servants they passed, pulling their rich silks tighter to avoid contamination. Evangeline kept her gaze fixed firmly on the polished stone floor, enduring the casual cruelty of her world with the quiet dignity she had spent a lifetime perfecting. She focused on the steady rhythm of her own breathing, carefully ignoring the painful throbbing in her collused hands. The royal sanctuary was breathtaking, beautiful in the way a drawn blade was beautiful. Massive pillars of polished black obsidian reached up toward a vaulted ceiling of frosted glass, allowing the pale, ethereal light of the full moon to spill across the polished marble floor. The cavernous hall was packed with the highest-ranking members of the northern packs. Silks of midnight blue, deep emerald, and silver rustled as the nobles whispered among themselves, their faces tight with anticipation and barely concealed terror. At the far end of the sanctuary stood the ancient stone altar, covered in a cloth of pure white silk. Standing beside the altar was Silas Thorne, the solemn High Court elder. He was a towering ancient figure, wrapped in heavy furs, his face lined with the deep scars of 100 battles and 1,000 harsh winters. In his weathered, heavily veined hands, he held a small cushion of dark velvet. Resting atop the velvet was the legendary relic. It was a simple, unadorned band of pure silver, yet it seemed to generate its own internal light. A soft, glowing moonfire aura radiated from the metal, casting long, eerie shadows across the elder's solemn face. The artifact hummed with an undeniable, terrifying sentience. Evangeline hung back by the heavy wooden doors, pressing her shoulders against the freezing stone wall to remain out of sight. Even from this distance, the sight of the glowing band made her breath catch in her throat. A sudden, sharp spike of heat flared in her right wrist, a phantom burn that throbbed in rhythm with her racing pulse. She clamped her left hand over the burning sensation, her eyes wide as she watched the soft silver light. Her latent cosmic magic hummed violently beneath her skin, picking up the ancient resonance. It was not a tool of political conquest. It was a living heartbeat, a testament to the divine bond of fated mates. Silence in the Hall of the Ancestors. Silas's voice boomed, echoing off the obsidian walls and instantly silencing the murmuring crowd. His gaze swept over the gathered nobles, his expression hard and unforgiving. The lunar alignment is upon us. Tonight, the sacred silver shall seek its true vessel. It does not care for your titles. It does not care for your wealth. It judges only the depth of the soul, the strength of the bond, and the truth of the blood. The elder stepped forward, lowering the velvet cushion slightly so the moonlight could strike the silver band. The Alpha King approaches. Before he enters, the relic must be offered to the moon. Let no one touch the sacred band until the ritual is complete, for the ancestors are watching, and their judgment is absolute. But Althea Mercer was not a woman who waited for permission. Driven by a manic, desperate greed, Althea stepped out of the line of high-born suitors. Her crimson dress dragged across the marble as she marched directly toward the altar, completely ignoring the shocked gasps of the surrounding nobles. Evangeline's heart slammed against her ribs in sheer panic. She took a half-step forward out of the shadows, her hand reaching out involuntarily to stop the inevitable disaster. "Althea, no," she whispered, the desperate words swallowed entirely by the vastness of the silent hall. "Step back, child of Mercer," the elder warned, his voice dropping to a dangerous, rumbling growl that vibrated through the floorboards. He pulled the cushion back, his eyes narrowing in fury. "The ritual has not begun. The king is not present. You violate the sacred law of this court." "I am the law," Althea shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly through the cavernous space. "I am the most beautiful, the most powerful. I am the true Luna of this frost-bound realm, and I will not wait for some archaic ritual to grant me what is already mine." Before the guards could be summoned, Althea lunged forward with terrifying speed. Her hand darted out like a striking viper, and her manicured fingers closed violently around the sacred relic. The sanctuary descended into absolute, horrifying silence. For one long, agonizing second, nothing happened. Althea held the silver band up in the air, a triumphant, cruel smile spreading across her flawless face. She looked back at the terrified crowd, her eyes shining with manic victory. She brought the metal downs, sliding it triumphantly onto the index finger of her right hand. The backlash was instantaneous and severe. The soft, glowing silver light of the Moonlight Ring violently shifted, snapping into a blinding flash of hostile frost blue energy. A sound like shattering glass echoed through the hall, a high-pitched magical resonance so loud that several nobles covered their ears in pain. Althea's triumphant smile dissolved into a mask of pure, unadulterated shock, A desperate scream ripped from her throat, a sound of such visceral, helpless terror that it made Evangeline's blood run completely cold. She fell to her knees on the hard marble floor, the impact bruising her legs beneath the velvet. She grabbed at the ring with her left hand, pulling frantically, but the silver band had contracted fiercely, refusing to release her flesh. The ancient curse of the relic had fully awakened to defend itself. A thick, opaque layer of jagged blue-white frost erupted from the metal, rapidly spreading over Althea's knuckles. The spiritual freeze began to aggressively numb her hand, locking the joints in an agonizing, unyielding grip. It was not a physical wound of blood and torn flesh, but a terrifying, supernatural cold that threatened to stop her heart. Althea thrashed wildly on the floor, her beautiful crimson dress tangling around her legs, her pristine image entirely unraveled in mere seconds as she wept, her perfect makeup smudged by desperate, freezing tears. "Help me! Someone help me! Cut it off!" she wailed, her voice cracking in pure agony. No one moved. The nobles shrank back in terror, pressing themselves against the obsidian pillars to avoid the wrath of the cursed magic. The old man simply looked down at the writhing girl, his face a mask of cold, ancient sorrow. "You were warned," Silas murmured softly, his voice devoid of pity. "The ring does not accept the greedy. It punishes the hollow, and it will not release you until the true Luna steps forward." Evangeline felt a surge of terrifying, helpless panic. Despite years of cruelty, despite every insult and stinging slap, her innate protective instinct surged forward. She took a step toward her sister, her calloused hands trembling, ready to run forward and pull Althea away from the altar, even if it meant absorbing the freezing curse herself. But before Evangeline could take another step, the massive, iron-bound doors of the sanctuary blew open with the force of a detonating bomb. A freezing, violent gust of wind swept into the hall, instantly extinguishing half the candles and plunging the room into chaotic, flickering shadows. The temperature in the sanctuary plummeted so rapidly that frost immediately bloomed across the massive marble floor, freezing the moisture in the air into a glittering mist. Standing in the doorway, wreathed in shadows and drifting snow, was Kaelen Sterling. The Alpha King of this icy domain was terrifying. He was a towering, massive mountain of a man, his broad shoulders draped in a heavy cloak of black wolf fur. His jaw was clenched in a hard, brutal line, and his storm-grey eyes literally glowed with the feral, predatory light of his inner beast. The air around him cracked with raw, volatile, elemental power, a physical manifestation of the agonizing terminal spiritual frost that was slowly killing him from the inside out. He exuded an aura of absolute, unyielding dominance. He was a monster, a lethal, blood-soaked sovereign who had buried his enemies beneath mountains of unbreakable ice. The entire court immediately dropped to their knees, bowing their heads in complete terrified submission. Only Althea remained upright, still thrashing and crying on the floor, her arm encased in creeping, jagged ice. "My king!" Althea sobbed, holding up her freezing pale hand as Kaelen began to walk down the center aisle. Her voice was a pathetic, broken wheeze. "Save me, the ring! I took it for you. I am your mate. Please, you have to save me." Kaelen did not even blink. He did not slow his heavy predatory stride. As he passed Althea, he did not look down. He simply stepped around her writhing body as if she were a discarded piece of broken furniture, his expression completely stone-cold and indifferent to her suffering. His massive boots echoed loudly on the marble, each step precise, deliberate, and utterly terrifying. He walked past the high-born ladies trembling in their fine silks. He walked past Silas, who bowed deeply in reverence. He walked past the ancient stone altar entirely, ignoring the sacred relic and the screaming woman beside it. Evangeline remained frozen by the far wall, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The burning sensation on her wrist was now a searing, blinding heat, a throbbing pulse of molten gold that contrasted sharply with the freezing air of the sanctuary. She kept her head bowed, staring at the scuffed toes of her worn leather boots, praying to the ancestors that the Alpha King would simply pass her by, that her lifelong invisibility would protect her now, in the face of this beautiful, terrifying monster. The heavy footsteps stopped. Evangeline's breath caught painfully in her throat. The scent of him washed over her, a powerful, intoxicating blend of dark pine, fresh snowfall, and old, worn leather. It was a scent that commanded absolute surrender, yet beneath the terrifying power, Evangeline's dormant veil sight picked up something else. She sensed a deep, agonizing loneliness, a massive bleeding fracture in his soul, a hollow, freezing void that desperately, silently begged for warmth. Slowly, helplessly, Evangeline raised her head. Kaelen stood towering over her, casting a massive shadow that blocked out the ethereal moonlight. Up close, he was even more intimidating, a jagged, beautiful weapon of a man carved from ice and fury, but his striking gaze was no longer cold. As they locked onto Evangeline's pale, soot-smudged face, the glowing grey irises suddenly flared, shifting violently into a burning, molten gold. His massive chest heaved, a low, rumbling growl tearing from his throat, a sound not of anger, but of desperate, agonizing relief. He reached out, his massive, scar-covered hand moving with shocking, terrifying gentleness. He did not grab her. He did not force her to submit. He simply cupped the side of her face, his large thumb brushing away a smudge of hearth ash from her cheek with a reverence reserved for goddesses. His skin was freezing cold, yet where he touched her, a sudden, explosive burst of radiant warmth surged through Evangeline's veins. The deep, golden heat of her dormant cosmic magic flared to life, instantly thawing the ambient frost that had begun creeping along her own skin. As the warmth radiated outward, enveloping them both in a cocoon of light, a profound, physical shudder racked Kaelen's massive frame. His ragged breathing settled into a deep, steady rhythm, the agonizing tension of his winter curse melting away beneath her gentle touch. "Mine," Kaelen whispered, his voice a deep, gravelly vibration that resonated directly in her bones, completely shattering the 19 years of invisibility she had worn like a shield. The court gasped in collective, horrified shock. Silas's eyes widened as he witnessed the divine selection, recognizing the ancient truth written in the sudden thaw. Althea ceased her crying for a fraction of a second, her face twisting into an expression of absolute, uncomprehending disbelief as she watched the fabled beast ignore her royal beauty to touch the face of a soot-stained scullery maid. Kaelen did not care about the shocked gasps of the court. He did not care about the weeping sister or the stunned elders. He stared down at Evangeline, his golden eyes raw, vulnerable, and fiercely protective. Slowly, the most feared beast in the frosted lands sank to one knee, lowering his massive, intimidating frame before the lowest servant in the room. He bowed his head, pressing his forehead gently against Evangeline's stomach, exhaling a long, shuddering breath as if he had just finished a brutal 100-year war and had finally, miraculously, found his true sanctuary. Evangeline stood perfectly still, her calloused hands trembling as they hovered awkwardly over his broad, fur-draped shoulders. She had been invisible her entire life. She was a girl who was never there, yet now, the most powerful Alpha King in 3 kingdoms was kneeling at her feet in complete submission, his terrifying reputation entirely unraveled by the simple warmth of her presence. As her trembling fingers slowly descended to tangle in his dark hair, the dormant magic in her blood awoke fully, singing a bright, ancient song of pure, undeniable fire. The golden warmth radiating from Evangeline's fingertips seemed to freeze the very breath in the lungs of the assembled nobles. No one moved. No one dared to speak. The cavernous sanctuary of Frostspire Castle was locked in a state of absolute, paralyzed disbelief. At the altar, the terrible sound of Althea's weeping had dissolved into a series of jagged, hyperventilating gasps as the cursed spiritual frost continued to lock her arm in an unyielding, pale grip. Yet the ruthless monarch remained utterly blind, to the beautiful broken woman, bleeding status on the marble floor. Kaelen Sterling was entirely consumed by the fragile, soot-stained girl standing before him. He kept his forehead pressed gently against her stomach, anchoring himself to her small frame as if she were the only still solid object in a world built of shattered ice. Evangeline stared down at the broad, muscle-corded expanse of his back. Her fingers were still tangled in the thick, dark strands of his hair. The somatic feedback of their physical contact was overwhelming. For 19 years, her body had known only the stinging bite of a riding crop, the freezing ache of scrubbing stone floors, and the hollow emptiness of starvation. Now, a profound, heavy heat was flooding her veins, an ancient molten resonance that chased away the damp chill of her scullery dress. The throbbing pain in her swollen knuckles vanished, replaced by a soothing golden hum that originated deep within her chest and vibrated through her very bones. She could feel the steady, thrumming pulse of his beast, settling into a state of absolute reverent peace. Silas Thorne was the first to break the heavy silence. The ancient elder struck the base of his wooden staff against the obsidian floor, the sharp crack echoing like a gunshot. "The moon has spoken," he declared, his voice trembling with a mixture of profound awe and deep ancestral terror. "The true vessel has been found. The Alpha King has recognized his Luna." The proclamation sent a violent ripple through the crowd. The high-born ladies, draped in their exquisite silks, shrank back against the towering pillars, their faces pale with shock and outrage. They had spent their entire lives grooming themselves for the obsidian throne, only to watch the most powerful male in 3 realms kneel in the dirt for a silent, invisible servant. The air grew thick with the cloying scent of their panic and bitter jealousy. But it could not touch the sacred boundary drawn between the king and his mate. Kaelen finally lifted his head, his tempestuous irises, still swirling with flecks of feral, protective gold, searched Evangeline's face. He did not look at her smudged cheeks, her frayed collar, or the harsh calluses on her hands with pity. He looked at her with a desperate, starving reverence. Slowly, the massive Alpha King rose to his full, terrifying height. He dwarfed her completely, his broad shoulders blocking out the pale moonlight, filtering through the vaulted ceiling. Before Evangeline could take a nervous step back, Kaelen moved. He did not ask for permission, yet there was no violence in his action. He simply swept his massive, fur-clad arms beneath her knees and behind her back, lifting her off the freezing marble floor as easily as if she weighed nothing at all. "Put me down," she whispered instinctively, her voice barely a breath, terrified that her soot-stained clothes would ruin his magnificent royal garments. "I am dirty. I am not. I do not belong up there. You belong exactly where I hold you," he rumbled, his deep voice vibrating against her chest. "And you will never touch a cold floor in this fortress again." Without another word, the Alpha King turned his back on the sacred altar, entirely ignoring the chaotic whispers of the High Council and the pathetic, freezing sobs of Althea Mercer. He carried Evangeline out of the sanctuary, his long, predatory strides eating up the distance down the grand corridors. The transition from the lower levels to the royal wing was a blur of shifting environmental sensations. The heavy, oppressive scent of crushed gardenias and fear faded, replaced by the crisp, clean aroma of high-altitude snow and burning cedar. The flickering torches on the walls cast long, dancing shadows over the statues of ancient kings, their stone faces seeming to bow as Kaelen carried his newly discovered mate past them. The rhythmic cadence of his footsteps acted as a soothing lullaby to her exhausted spirit. Evangeline kept her face buried in the crook of his neck, too overwhelmed to look at the passing guards, who dropped to their knees in immediate submission. The sheer physical reality of his body was intoxicating. Beneath the thick layers of leather and fur, Kaelen was radiating a volatile, desperate heat. She could feel the violent, irregular rhythm of his heart beating against her ribs, a physical manifestation of a man who had spent a lifetime fighting a losing battle against his own cursed blood. Her innate cosmic truth sight, now fully awakened by their proximity, perceived the faint, jagged lines of frost-blue, magical energy wrapping around his heart, threatening to freeze him from the inside out. Yet, wherever her body pressed against his, the frost retreated, melting away beneath the golden warmth of her latent magic. They reached the highest level of Frostspire Castle. Kaelen kicked open a set of massive, iron-bound oak doors, carrying her into his private sanctuary. The royal bedchamber was vast and cavernous, dominated by a towering stone hearth where a massive fire roared, casting a deep, flickering orange glow across the obsidian walls. Heavy velvet drapes in deep midnight blue were pulled tight against the mountain winds, and thick plush furs blanketed the dark wooden floors. It was a room built for a solitary beast, stark and devoid of delicate ornamentation, yet it felt infinitely safer than any place Evangeline had ever known. The lingering scent of pine needles and stark winter frost clung to the tapestries. Kaelen walked directly to the center of the room and gently lowered her onto a massive, fur-draped settee situated near the roaring fire. He did not loom over her. The moment her worn leather boots touched the thick rug, he immediately took 2 large steps back, putting deliberate, respectful physical distance between them. He watched her carefully, his broad chest heaving, his hands curling into tight fists at his sides, as if fighting every predatory instinct in his body that screamed to pull her close again. Evangeline sat frozen, her calloused hands resting rigidly on her knees. The sudden quiet of the room was deafening. The sheer impossibility of her situation crashed over her in a suffocating wave. She was Evangeline Mercer, the invisible scullery maid, the defect of her noble family. She was supposed to be scrubbing the cellars, hiding from her mother's riding crop, praying for a stale crust of bread. Instead, she was sitting in the private chambers of the most feared sovereign in the entire hemisphere. She waited for the illusion to shatter. She waited for him to bark an order, to demand her service, to look at her with the familiar, crushing disgust she had endured for 19 years. She squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the inevitable strike of a phantom hand. Instead, Kaelen moved to a heavy silver tray resting on a dark wood table. He poured a goblet of dark, honeyed wine, the rich, spiced scent of it immediately warming the cool air. He turned back to her, his movements slow and meticulously telegraphed to avoid startling her. He knelt beside the settee, keeping himself lower than her eye level, and offered the silver goblet. "Drink," he murmured softly. His piercing stare was entirely focused on her pale, shivering frame. "You are freezing. Your lips are blue." Evangeline stared at the goblet, then up at his rugged, terrifying face. The contrast between his brutal reputation and his gentle actions made her breath catch painfully. "They call you a monster," she whispered, the words slipping out before her lifelong habit of silence could stop them. Her heart pounded frantically at her own insolence, expecting an immediate, violent reprimand. "I am a monster to the world," he replied, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "Because monsters do not kneel to speak to children. Because monsters do not search for a year. Because monsters do not look at me the way you do." Evangeline's breath hitched as she absorbed his words, recognizing the profound truth hidden within the metaphor. She understood then that his terrifying beast did not desire destruction. He was telling her that true strength was measured not by violence, but by how fiercely the powerful protected the truly vulnerable. He slowly reached out, his large fingers gently wrapping around her small, trembling hands, guiding the goblet to her lips. "But I am not a monster to you. I will never be a monster to you." The sheer, unadulterated sincerity in his voice brought a sudden, violent sting of tears to Evangeline's eyes. She took a small sip of the warm, spiced wine, letting the rich liquid chase away the lingering chill in her throat. The heat of the fire pressed against her back, but it was the profound, unginginal safety radiating from the massive Alpha King that finally caused her defensive walls to crack. For the first time in her life, she did not feel the need to make herself small. She did not feel the need to disappear. "But the ring," Evangeline murmured, her voice trembling as she lowered the silver cup, her gaze drifting toward the heavy oak doors that separated them from the chaotic court. "The Moonlight Ring." Althea took it. It froze her hand. "The elders said it was meant for the true Luna, but my sister is the beautiful one. She is the one trained to rule. I am nothing. I have no wolf. I have no magic. Your sister is a fool," he stated flatly, the cold authority of the Alpha King returning to his tone for a brief, terrifying second. She believed that an ancient, sacred relic was a simple piece of jewelry to be snatched for political gain. The Moonlight Ring does not care about flawless skin or the ambitious lies of a decaying noble house. It is a spiritual anchor, forged by the ancestors to test the absolute alignment of the soul. He shifted his weight on the rug, his massive frame still kneeling attentively beside her. "The ring rejected her because her soul is entirely hollow," Kaelen continued, his voice softening as he looked back into Evangeline's eyes. "It punished her greed. The relic demands absolute sacrifice, absolute truth, and a spirit capable of bearing the immense crushing weight of the realm. When I walked into that sanctuary, my beast did not even register her existence. My inner wolf was completely hopelessly consumed by the scent of pine needles, hearth ash, and a quiet, unyielding strength that I have searched for my entire life." Evangeline's breath hitched. She looked down at her own lap, her fingers tracing the worn, frayed edge of her grey scullery dress. "But I am broken," she whispered, the deeply ingrained words of her abusive mother echoing loudly in her mind. "I cannot give you a royal heir. I cannot shift. The entire court saw you carry away a maid. They will say you are mad. They will challenge your throne. Let them," Kaelen replied instantly, his voice entirely devoid of hesitation. "I would burn the entire winter court to ash before I let them touch a single hair on your head, because when I saw you standing there, silent and invisible in the shadows, something in me roared that I had to claim you, even if claiming you destroys the very foundations of my kingdom." Evangeline looked up, stunned by the absolute violent certainty in his vow. The deep, somatic throbbing in her right wrist suddenly flared again, a searing, bright pulse of heat that demanded her immediate attention. She rubbed the spot instinctively, her latent truth sight picking up a massive surge of elemental resonance in the room. The air grew thick, vibrating with the unseen, ancient magic of the fated mate bond. Kaelen tracked her movement. His eyes locked onto her wrist, understanding dawning in his sharp, predatory features. He slowly set the silver goblet aside on the dark wood floor. "I am cursed, Evangeline," he said quietly, the heavy, agonizing weight of his history bleeding into his words. "The bloodline of the Northern Kings carries a terminal spiritual frost. It is a defense mechanism built centuries ago, designed to make us ruthless in battle, to turn our hearts to unfeeling ice, but the magic was flawed. Over time, the ice turns inward. It freezes the soul, suppresses the wolf, and slowly kills the host from the inside out." He reached up, his large hands gripping the heavy clasps of his black wolf fur cloak. He unfastened the silver buckles, letting the massive pelt slide off his broad shoulders and pool onto the floor. Next, he reached for the collar of his dark leather tunic. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, his silver-hued eyes seeking her permission. When Evangeline gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod, he pulled the heavy fabric over his head, exposing the massive, muscular expanse of his chest and shoulders to the flickering firelight. Evangeline gasped, her hands flying to her mouth in sheer horror. The left side of his torso was covered in a network of brutal, jagged scars. They looked like deep fissures carved into solid granite, raised and violently angry. But it was not the physical scars that made her heart stop. It was the terrifying, opaque layer of blue-white spiritual frost that webbed across his skin, originating from a massive, glowing mark on his left shoulder. The frost was literally creeping up his neck, a physical manifestation of the ancient, deadly curse he had carried in absolute silence. Yet, at the very center of the agonizing frost, right over the heavy muscle of his shoulder, was a crescent-shaped claiming mark, and it was burning. It was not the cold, dead blue of his curse. It was glowing with a fierce, brilliant, molten gold light, the exact same golden light that currently throbbed beneath the skin of Evangeline's own wrist. The stark sensory contrast of the freezing winter frost versus the internal glowing warmth was completely mesmerizing. The hollow mark doesn't just contain your power, it creates a void, an absence once where your magic should be, Kaelen murmured, referencing the ancient lore of the fated bond that had bound their ancestors. For years, this mark has been dark. It has been an open, bleeding wound in my soul, an agonizing reminder that I was dying alone in the cold. Every healer in the kingdom tried to thaw the frost. Every high-born lady offered her blood, hoping to break the curse and claim the crown. But the ice only grew thicker, because the magic cannot be tricked. It can only be answered by its true cosmic equal. He leaned forward slightly, closing the distance between them, his glowing golden eyes locking onto hers with a raw vulnerability that completely shattered his terrifying reputation. "Touch it, Evangeline," he pleaded, his voice breaking into a rough, desperate whisper. "Please." Evangeline did not hesitate. The lifetime of fear, the ingrained instinct to remain invisible, completely vanished in the face of his agonizing vulnerability. She reached out, her small, calloused hand trembling violently as she bridged the gap between them. She bypassed the terrifying network of scars and pressed her palm directly against the glowing crescent mark on his shoulder. The reaction was instantaneous and explosive. The moment her skin made contact with the mark, her dormant cosmic magic fully detonated. The royal bedchamber vanished from her perception, replaced by a blinding, rushing torrent of golden energy. She did not just feel his skin, she felt the absolute, staggering depth of his soul. She felt the crushing, agonizing loneliness of his reign, the desperate, freezing nights he had spent fighting the beast within, and the profound, unquestionable devotion he already harbored for her. Her latent solar lineage, the forgotten divine magic buried deep in her blood, roared to life. A brilliant, blinding aura of golden light erupted from her palm, shooting directly into his massive chest. Kaelen threw his head back, a guttural, tearing roar ripping from his throat. The sound echoed off the obsidian walls, a primal noise of absolute staggering relief. Beneath Evangeline's fingertips, the terrifying blue-white frost that had choked his veins for a decade began to aggressively melt. It hissed and turned to steam, dissolving into the air as her golden warmth flooded his system, repairing the jagged, bleeding fractures in his spirit. The violent, irregular rhythm of his heart settled into a deep, powerful, and steady beat, resonating perfectly with her own pulse. When the blinding light finally faded, the room returned to the quiet, flickering glow of the hearth fire. Evangeline's chest heaved as she pulled her hand back, her breathing ragged, her entire body humming with the exhausting, exhilarating aftermath of the magical surge. She stared in breathless wonder at the undeniable proof of her hidden power. Kaelen remained kneeling before her. The frost on his shoulder was entirely gone, leaving only the healthy, flushed skin of a powerful alpha and the brilliantly glowing, permanent golden mark of their bonded souls. He looked up at her, his slate-colored gaze clear and bright, entirely free of the feral madness that had clouded them only an hour ago. The terrifying sovereign had been entirely gentled, anchored to the world by a girl who had spent her life believing she was nothing. He reached out, his large hands carefully encompassing her small, trembling ones. He brought her knuckles to his lips, pressing a deep, reverent kiss against the bruised and bleeding skin where she had scrubbed the stone floors that very morning. He treated her scarred hands with the profound tenderness reserved for a priceless artifact. "You are not broken, Evangeline," Kaelen whispered fiercely against her skin, his breath sending a cascade of warm shivers down her spine. You are the only true magic left in this world, and I will spend the rest of my life proving it to you." Evangeline looked into the eyes of the terrifying, cursed beast who held her heart in his massive hands. Outside the thick stone walls of the royal sanctuary, the wind howled with the promise of a coming storm. She knew her ambitious sister and her cruel family would not accept this defeat. The High Council would demand answers. The kingdom would plunge into chaos over a scullery maid stealing the Alpha King. But as she sat in the absolute unconditional warmth of his private sanctuary, feeling the steady, thrumming pulse of their undeniable bond, Evangeline finally realized the truth. She was no longer invisible. She had been found, and for the first time in her life, she was ready to fight for the light she had just discovered in the dark. The absolute, unconditional warmth of Kaelen's private sanctuary became a fragile but enduring bubble against the howling fury of the frozen palace. For the first week of their bonding, they did not leave the high-altitude fortress. Evangeline spent those quiet days sitting near the roaring hearth, surrounded by luxurious furs that stood in stark contrast to the threadbare scullery dresses she had worn her entire life. She remembered the freezing cellars where she had slept on moulding hay, enduring harsh punishments from Lady Mercer. Now, surrounded by absolute safety, her calloused fingers constantly traced the glowing crescent mark on her right wrist. The somatic feedback of their fated bond was a continuous, steady thrum of molten gold beneath her skin, a physical tether that perfectly mirrored the deep breathing of the massive beast who rarely left her side. Kaelen Sterling, the feared Alpha King, had draped himself in a fresh tunic of dark, supple leather. For the first time in a decade, the brutal scars on his massive shoulder were completely free of the deadly blue ice that had plagued his existence. The terminal spiritual frost was permanently gone, melted away by the blinding golden light of Evangeline's dormant magic. During that week, Kaelen focused entirely on teaching her the hidden truths of this glacial region. His voice, usually a terrifying rumble, was exceedingly gentle when he spoke to her. He explained that the Moonlight Ring, which was currently freezing her greedy sister to the bone, was never meant to be a mere political crown. It was an ancient, sacred silver band that judged the soul of its wearer, designed to bond only with the true vessel of the moon. As Evangeline listened to his deep voice, her dormant cosmic magic began to fully activate. This ancient magic did not just heal, it revealed the absolute truth of the world. She would look at the heavy stone walls of Frostspire Castle and see hidden historical glyphs glowing like silver stardust. Her newfound cosmic vision allowed her to read the spiritual energy woven into the foundation of the fortress. She saw the true origin of the ancestral curses and the undeniable proof of her own divine lineage. The hollow mark doesn't just contain your power, it creates a void, an absence where your magic should be. Kaelen murmured one evening, pressing his lips to the glowing crescent on her wrist. But now, that void was filled with an undeniable, radiant light that chased away the shadows of her traumatic past. But the quiet peace of their isolated haven could not last forever. By the time their first month together drew to a close, the political storm brewing outside could no longer be ignored. Althea Mercer and her ambitious family refused to accept their public defeat. Leveraging their immense wealth, the Mercer delegation staged a ruthless political coup. Venomous lies spread through the fortress. The Mercer family whispered to the elite packs that Kaelen's beast was dying, suppressed by the hex of a defective maid. They twisted the truth, declaring that Evangeline had used forbidden magic to manipulate the sacred altar. They claimed she had cursed the Moonlight Ring to reject Althea, ensnaring the Alpha King's mind to steal a throne that did not belong to her. These treacherous rumors were fueled by Althea's horrifying physical decline. The flawless jewel of the Mercer house was fading rapidly from her own greed. The sacred ring she had snatched remained violently clamped to her finger, and the immediate, painful backlash of its curse had expanded over 30 days. Her entire right arm was now encased in a thick layer of opaque spiritual frost, the piercing cold creeping steadily toward her heart. Instead of admitting her daughter's soul had been rejected by the divine relic, Lady Mercer weaponized Althea's agonizing pain. She rallied the elite alphas of the Highland packs to demand a formal trial before the High Council, intending to strip Kaelen of his crown and banish the woman who had allegedly cursed their true Luna. The tension reached its breaking point on the 32nd day after the claiming. The insulated peace of the royal sanctuary was suddenly shattered by the heavy thud of a fist striking the oak doors. Elder Silas Thorne stood in the freezing corridor, his ancient weathered face lined with heavy sorrow and rigid duty. "My king," the solemn elder called out, his voice echoing in the bitter draught. "The High Council has convened in the Obsidian Hall. The Mercer delegation demands an immediate audience. They have officially invoked the right of grievance, and the entire court is waiting." Kaelen let out a low, cavernous growl that vibrated the floorboards beneath Evangeline's feet. "Let them wait," the imposing alpha rumbled, his intense stare flashing with protective intent as he instinctively stepped in front of his mate. "If they wish to challenge my claim, they can do it to my face. I will not subject you to their poison." But Evangeline slowly stood up, stepping away from the roaring hearth. Her fraying grey scullery dress stood in stark contrast to the immense power pooling in her veins. The deep heat of the claiming mark throbbed against her pulse, a somatic warning that hiding would only feed the venom of her enemies. She walked across the thick rug, her small, calloused hand reaching out to gently touch his muscular forearm. "No," she whispered softly, her awakened cosmic magic picking up the chaotic energy swirling in the halls below. "If we do not face them now, the Mercer family will tear your kingdom apart with their lies. We must go down. I am ready to show them the truth." Kaelen looked down at her, the volatile anger in his eyes instantly melting into a profound, reverent gentleness. He reached out, his large, warm hand completely enveloping hers, anchoring her against what awaited them. He did not ask her to hide behind him, nor did he treat her as a fragile thing. He simply tucked her close to his side, leading her out of the sanctuary and into the freezing cavernous corridors of the royal wing. The descent into the lower levels of Frostspire Castle was abruptly cold. The ambient temperature plummeted, the biting winter draught, carrying the sharp scent of wet granite and aggressive wolves. Every step away from the sanctuary felt like walking into the maw of a predator, but Evangeline did not falter. She kept her head high, drawing immense physical strength from the radiant heat pouring off the Alpha King beside her. She was no longer the abused servant, forced to scrub these steps until her knuckles bled. She was walking beside the sovereign, bound by an ancient magic that hummed a defiant, golden song in her blood. The Obsidian Hall was a sprawling amphitheater of polished black stone, illuminated by massive iron chandeliers that cast flickering shadows over the assembly. The cavernous room was packed to the absolute brim with the elite alphas, commanders, and nobles of the northern capital, their faces tight with fear and morbid curiosity. As Kaelen and Evangeline entered through the massive archway, the deafening roar of the crowd instantly died, replaced by a suffocating, hostile silence. At the center of the hall, standing defiantly before the raised judgment seat, was the Mercer delegation. And it was Althea Mercer who drew the horrifying attention of the entire court. The flawless sister looked entirely unraveled, a tragic monument to her own unchecked ambition. Her pristine crimson velvet dress hung loosely off her shrinking frame. She was shivering violently, her once beautiful face pale and drawn, her lips tinged with a sickly blue hue. Her right arm, still bearing the sacred Moonlight Ring, was fully consumed by the unbreakable spiritual frost. She cradled the frozen limb against her chest, weeping openly, the manicured facade of her perfect life completely shattered by the ancient curse she had arrogantly invoked. "There she is!" Lady Mercer shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly off the vaulted ceilings as she pointed a trembling finger directly at Evangeline. "The traitor! Look at what she has done to your true Luna." Elder Silas Thorne stepped forward from the shadows, striking his wooden staff against the floor to demand order, but the furious matriarch refused to be silenced. "She is a defect," the woman continued, her eyes wide with desperate hatred. "Evangeline has no wolf, she has no noble grace. She used forbidden magic to hex the sacred ring. She has cursed my daughter. Banish her now, and the curse on Althea's arm will lift." A ripple of panicked whispers swept through the hall. Forbidden magic was an unforgivable offense in the Northern Territories. Evangeline felt a sharp, icy needle of fear pierce her chest, but before she could even flinch, Kaelen moved. He did not shout or argue with the hysterical woman. He simply released a low, earth-shaking growl that physically vibrated the massive stone pillars. The Alpha King stepped directly in front of Evangeline, his massive frame shielding her entirely from the hostile crowd. His metallic irises flared with blinding, molten gold, the unmistakable sign of a fully awakened fated mate. "You speak of treason, Lady Mercer," Kaelen rumbled, his voice a freezing caress that cut through the hall like a blade. "But the only treason I see is a greedy, hollow woman who dared to snatch a sacred relic without the blessing of the moon." He reached up and ruthlessly pulled the collar of his heavy leather tunic aside, exposing the thick muscle of his neck and shoulder to the court. The jagged battle scars were highly visible, but the dark blue frost that had plagued him for years was entirely gone. In its place, the crescent-shaped claiming mark glowed with a brilliant, undeniable solar light. Silas gasped, his ancient eyes widening in absolute awe as he recognized the divine healing that the court scholars had long deemed impossible. "The curse," the elder whispered reverently, his voice trembling with profound shock. "The terminal spiritual frost of the bloodline has been completely broken. The true vessel has mended the king, but the Mercer family was entirely blind to miracles. They only saw the slipping of their political power, the death of their dynastic greed." "It is an illusion," Lord Mercer bellowed, his face purple with rage as he aggressively stepped forward. "A trick of the hex. Remove the impostor from the castle, and restore my daughter to the throne." "Step back, Lord Mercer," Kaelen stated flatly, the raw, terrifying aura of his beast flooding the room like a hurricane chained inside a glass jar. He was a monster, yes, but a monster solely devoted to protecting the quiet maid standing behind him. Yet, before the Alpha King could unleash his fury upon the treasonous lord, a soft, radiant warmth washed over the dais. Evangeline stepped out from behind the massive barrier of her mate's body. She did not cower. She did not beg for the court's understanding. "We are small things in a world of teeth," she had once been told, but Evangeline finally understood that her smallness was a disguise she no longer needed. She simply let her dormant cosmic magic rise fully to the surface. Her grey eyes shifted into a luminous, glowing silver, beautiful in their ancient purity. The magic resting in her blood activated, illuminating the dark hall with a soft, ethereal light that made the shadows physically recoil. She walked directly toward her family, her steps silent. The elite alphas parted for her without a word, instinctively recognizing the supreme elemental power radiating from her small frame. Althea shrank back, sobbing hysterically as her sister approached. "The ring was never a crown, Althea." Evangeline's voice rang out, soft but echoing with an ancient, resonant authority that commanded absolute silence in the cavernous obsidian hall. "It was a mirror. It only showed you what was already inside your heart." Hollow, cold, and cruel, Evangeline reached out her bare, calloused hands. "No, do not touch me," Althea screamed, terrified of the glowing silver magic pooling in Evangeline's palms. But Evangeline did not strike her. With profound pity for the sibling who had made her life a living hell, Evangeline clamped her small hands directly over the jagged, opaque ice encasing Althea's right hand. The moment their skin made contact, Evangeline unleashed the full, devastating force of her truth-revealing magic. A blinding, explosive wave of golden, cosmic fire erupted from her to touch. The radiant light clashed violently with the terminal spiritual frost of the curse. The ice shrieked like a dying animal, cracking and splintering under the overwhelming heat of the true Luna's power. The piercing cold that had sought to consume Althea's limb was neutralized, absorbed harmlessly into Evangeline's overwhelming golden warmth, without leaving a single mark on her own pristine skin. The court watched in stunned, breathless silence as the deadly frost melted away into harmless, evaporating mist. With a gentle, effortless pull, Evangeline safely extracted the frozen Moonlight Ring from her sister's trembling, thawed finger. As the ancient sacred silver band slid into Evangeline's palm, it did not freeze. Instead, it recognized its true master. The ring flared with a brilliant, blinding lunar light, absorbing her golden warmth and harmonizing perfectly with the crescent claiming mark on her wrist. The somatic feedback was absolute, undeniable proof of her divine right. She had not used forbidden magic. She was the savior of the glacial empire, the only soul pure enough to bear the weight of the ancestors. Reaching out, she gently handed the relic to Elder Silas, entrusting it to the High Council until the formal rites could be completed. Althea collapsed onto the polished black stone, weeping in complete humiliation and defeat, her stolen glory turning to ash before the entire kingdom. Elder Silas Thorne was the first to drop to his knees, bowing his head in total submission to the stone floor. One by one, the elite alphas, commanders, and nobles of the vast Frostlands followed, their previous hostility replaced by absolute terrified reverence. The Mercer family stood frozen, completely humbled and silenced by the indisputable magic of the true vessel. Evangeline stood in the center of the hall, her silver-pale hair lifting in the residual magical current, beautiful in the way a blade was beautiful. She turned to look at Kaelen. The formidable ruler crossed the distance between them, ignoring the kneeling court entirely. He dropped to his knees before her, wrapping his massive arms around her waist, burying his face against her stomach. He was trembling, the fearsome king brought entirely to absolute submission by the quiet scullery maid who had saved his soul. She had been wrong to ever doubt her worth, because the Alpha King had finally discovered the truth, and he was fiercely keeping what was his, ensuring no one in the three realms would ever dare to cast her out again. The absolute submission of the pack in the Obsidian Hall had cemented Evangeline's place as the supreme sovereign, but the ancient magic of the Northern Territories demanded a steep toll for cosmic realignments. The sky above Frostspire Castle did not transition into the peaceful starlit indigo of a normal winter night following the trial. Instead, as the midnight hour approached, the celestial sphere bloated into a terrifying, bruised crimson. It was the blood moon, a rare and dangerous astronomical phenomenon that pulled the deepest, most violent tides of the werewolf spirit directly to the surface. The heavy, oppressive light bled through the frosted glass of the high towers, casting a sinister, red-tinged gloom over the polished stone corridors. The temperature inside the castle fluctuated wildly, shifting from freezing drafts to suffocating, feverish heat within seconds, signaling a massive atmospheric disturbance. Evangeline stood near the grand balcony of the newly assigned royal suite, her silver-pale hair catching the strange crimson light. She was no longer wearing the fraying grey, scullery dress of her past. She was draped in a flowing gown of pale silver silk, a garment befitting the true lunar of the realm. Yet, the luxury of her surroundings offered zero comfort against the sudden, violent somatic feedback radiating from her right wrist. The crescent-shaped claiming mark was no longer pulsing with a steady, comforting warmth. It was searing her flesh, burning with a frantic, agonizing heat that perfectly mirrored the sheer panic of her fated mate. A sharp, physical pain pulled tightly behind her ribs, a desperate warning from the ancient bond that Kaelen was in critical, life-threatening danger. The physical ice of the terminal spiritual frost on Kaelen's skin had indeed been permanently melted days ago, but that deadly chill was only the outermost layer of a much older, deeper affliction. The feral root of his bloodline, the psychological madness of the winter beast, had lain dormant in his marrow for generations. Now, triggered by the overwhelming lunar energy, Evangeline had unlocked from the sacred Moonlight Ring. The beast violently rebelled against the sudden influx of pure light. The ancestral curse sought to reclaim its host, tearing through his mental defenses with brutal, unyielding efficiency. A guttural, earth-shattering roar tore through the upper corridor, a sound so primal and devastating that it vibrated the solid obsidian floorboards beneath Evangeline's feet. She did not hesitate. She sprinted out of her suite, navigating the cavernous hallways with desperate, breathless speed. When she reached the massive iron-bound oak doors of the king's private bedchamber, she found a scene of absolute, terrifying chaos. The elite royal guards, hardened warriors who had faced entire rival armies without flinching, were backed against the stone walls in sheer terror. The heavy oak doors were actively buckling outward. Deep, violent fissures splintered the ancient wood from the inside, accompanied by the horrifying sound of massive claws gouging solid stone and tearing through metal. "Step away from the doors," Evangeline commanded, her voice ringing out with an absolute, resonant authority that shocked even the seasoned commanders into immediate compliance. She did not wait for them to assist her. She pressed her small, calloused hands against the splintering wood and pushed her way inside. The vast chamber had been reduced to a pulverized war zone. The luxurious midnight blue velvet drapes were shredded into unrecognizable ribbons. The massive stone hearth had been partially demolished, scattering burning, smoking embers across the thick furs covering the floor. The air was thick with the metallic scent of fresh blood, wild pine, and freezing ozone. In the center of the ruins stood Kaelen Sterling. He was no longer the towering, stoic Alpha King who had knelt before her in the sanctuary. He was trapped in a horrifying, mid-shift state, an enormous amalgamation of heavily muscled man and feral dire wolf. Thick, coarse black fur erupted along his broad spine and massive shoulders. His powerful hands ended in lethal, razor-sharp talons that dripped with his own blood from frantically tearing at the reinforced walls. His familiar gaze was entirely gone, replaced by a mindless, glowing crimson rage that recognized nothing but violence and blind panic. The atmospheric pressure in the room was crushing, a heavy, suffocating weight that threatened to force Evangeline to her knees. The monster whipped its massive head toward the doorway. A low, terrifying snarl vibrated from its chest, exposing elongated, lethal fangs. It hunched forward, its massive muscles coiling like steel springs, preparing to launch itself at the perceived intruder. The sheer terror radiating from the creature was specifically designed to break the minds of lesser wolves, to force absolute submission through overwhelming fear. Her cruel mother had once whispered twisted lessons about survival in the dark cellars, reminding her of her complete insignificance in a brutal world. But Evangeline knew now that true strength was not about hiding in the shadows. It was about standing entirely visible in the face of total annihilation. She did not step back. She did not raise her hands in defense. As the massive beast stalked forward, its crimson eyes locked fiercely on her throat, Evangeline's dormant veil sight fully and explosively activated. The physical destruction of the pulverized room instantly faded into a negative, ethereal landscape of blinding spiritual energy. She did not just see a feral monster preparing to strike. She saw the brutal, underlying architecture of his immense agony. Suspended in the air around him were the true spiritual curse lines. They manifested as thick, jagged chains of ancient, shadowy ice that wrapped fiercely around his glowing wolf spirit. These ethereal chains were actively suffocating him. deeply inscribed with the historical glyphs of his ancestors' worst sins. The curse was a living parasite, feeding aggressively on the chaotic energy of the blood moon to strangle the true king from the inside out. Evangeline walked deliberately into the center of the ruined chamber, her silver silk gown gliding over the shattered stone. The beast lunged. It crossed the distance in a terrifying blur of black fur and lethal claws, stopping mere inches from her fragile frame. The sheer physical force of its sudden arrival sent a violent gust of wind through her pale hair. The monster snapped its massive jaws, the deadly teeth grazing the delicate, flushed skin of her collarbone. A single, trembling breath escaped her lips, but her feet remained firmly planted on the rug. She looked directly into the mindless, glowing crimson eyes, refusing to let the terror of the beast overshadow the profound truth of the broken man trapped beneath the nightmare. She understood the depth of his isolation, the centuries of psychological torment his bloodline had endured in absolute silence. "I am here," Evangeline whispered, her voice a steady, rhythmic anchor cutting through the chaotic maelstrom of the room. "I am not running away, because when I saw you lying there, broken and abandoned, something in me roared that I had to save you, even if saving you destroys me." The vow carried the heavy, undeniable resonance of her true lunar magic, a declaration of absolute loyalty that vibrated deeply within the stone walls of the fortress. She reached out, her small, calloused hands glowing with a brilliant, blinding silver stardust. She pressed her glowing palms directly against his massive furred cheeks. The beast flinched violently, a guttural, agonizing whine ripping from its throat as the supreme cosmic heat of her magic clashed with the shadowy ice of the curse. Evangeline stepped closer, closing the final inch of distance between them. She slid her arms upward to completely bracket his massive, terrifying face. With absolute, unyielding devotion, she leaned forward and pressed her forehead directly against his massive, heavy brow. The physical contact detonated a massive shockwave of raw, celestial power. The brilliant silver light of her veil sight magic flooded the entire bedchamber, instantly overwhelming and banishing the sinister crimson glow of the blood moon. Evangeline focused entirely on the thick, jagged chains of ancient ice binding his spirit. She poured every ounce of her radiant, molten gold warmth directly into his chest, flooding his soul with unconditional acceptance and profound peace. The heavy, dark lines of the ancestral curse shrieked in defeat. It was a high-pitched, supernatural resonance that shattered the remaining frosted glass in the window panes, sending shards glittering onto the balcony. The ethereal chains violently snapped, breaking apart under the overwhelming purity of her truth sight. The remnants of the curse dissolved into harmless, glowing embers that floated upward like fireflies, eventually vanishing entirely into the dark stone ceiling. The violent trembling in the massive beast suddenly ceased. The terrifying, muscular tension completely drained from his towering, aggressive frame. Evangeline felt the coarse black fur rapidly receding beneath her fingertips, replaced by the smooth, feverishly hot skin of the Alpha King. The glowing crimson faded entirely from his gaze, revealing the deeply familiar, exhausted pale eyes of Kaelen Sterling. He blinked slowly, staring down at her with a mixture of profound awe, lingering terror, and agonizing relief. The Alpha King's legs finally gave out. The sheer exhaustion of fighting the ancient curse for a decade, combined with surviving the violent exorcism of the blood moon, finally broke his legendary, monstrous stamina. He collapsed forward, his massive body crumpling heavily toward the floor. Evangeline dropped to her knees with him, catching his heavy head and guiding him safely down into her lap. He buried his face deep in the folds of her pale silver silk gown, his broad shoulders shaking with silent, ragged, devastating sobs. The terrifying warlord was entirely undone. The most feared sovereign in the territories was surrendering his absolute vulnerability to the only woman who possessed the immense strength required to hold him. The chaotic atmospheric pressure in the room fully stabilized, replaced by the quiet, steady rhythm of the hearth fire, slowly coming back to life amidst the ruins. Evangeline sat peacefully amid the pulverized remnants of the royal bedchamber, her delicate fingers gently threading through the damp, dark strands of his hair. She rocked him slowly, humming a soft, ancient melody that completely banished the lingering shadows of the feral curse from the corners of his mind. The searing, agonizing heat of the claiming mark on her wrist faded back into a warm, comfortable, molten gold thrum. The physical feedback of the fated bond confirmed that his soul was completely, permanently secure from the ancestral madness. The beast had finally been laid to rest, replaced entirely by the devoted, fiercely protective man who loved her. Evangeline looked down at the fearsome sovereign, now sleeping peacefully against her chest like a weary traveler who had finally found his way home after a lifetime of freezing in the dark. The legends of the snowy citadel would have to be entirely rewritten by the morning light. No woman lasted a night with him. They had whispered in the damp, freezing cellars of her past, but one woman did. One woman lasted a lifetime. The morning light that filtered through the shattered balcony doors of the royal bedchamber did not carry the usual bitter, biting edge of the northern winter. For the first time in a decade, the sun pierced the heavy, perpetual cloud cover over Frostspire Castle, casting long, golden beams across the pulverized remnants of the king's sanctuary. The physical destruction of the room, the shredded midnight blue velvet drapes, the splintered oak doors, and the shattered frosted glass stood as a chaotic, silent monument to the final death of the winter beast. Evangeline, Mercer, lay nestled deep within the surviving layers of thick white fox furs, her small frame completely enveloped by the massive, protective bulk of the Alpha King. She did not open her eyes immediately, choosing instead to let her heightened senses map the absolute, unconditional safety of her new reality. The violent, atmospheric pressure that had suffocated the castle during the blood moon was entirely gone, replaced by a crisp, clean stillness that smelled of melting snow and wild cedar. Beneath her cheek, the steady, powerful rhythm of Kaelen's heart thumped with a slow, heavy reassurance. It was no longer the frantic, irregular pulse of a man fighting a terminal spiritual frost. It was the calm, grounded heartbeat of a sovereign who had finally been anchored to the earth. The fated mate bond, secured by the crescent-shaped claiming mark on her right wrist, pulsed with a warm, comfortable, molten gold thrum. Evangeline slowly blinked, her silver-grey eyes open, her veil sight instantly picking up the soft, lingering embers of her own cosmic magic, still floating like stardust near the vaulted ceiling. She tilted her head back against the heavy muscular forearm, draped protectively over her waist. Kaelen Sterling was already awake. The terrifying warlord was watching her with a level of profound, unguarded reverence that made her breath catch painfully in her throat. His steely irises were incredibly clear, entirely stripped of the feral glowing crimson rage that had consumed him the night before. The brutal, jagged battle scars along his left shoulder, once choked by opaque blue ice, were now nothing more than faded, silvered lines of a history he no longer had to fight alone. He raised his heavily corlused hand, the same hand that possessed lethal, razor-sharp talons only hours ago, and gently tucked a loose strand of her pale silver hair behind her ear. "The beast is gone," Kaelen murmured, his deep, gravelly voice vibrating directly into her bones. "I searched the darkest corners of my own mind this morning, expecting the ice, expecting the hunger, but there is nothing there. There is only you. You burned it all away, Evangeline. You gave me back my soul." Evangeline closed her eyes, her small hands moving up to tangle in the thick, dark strands of his hair. She had spent 19 years believing she was fundamentally defective, a wolfless stain on a noble family, yet her quiet resilience had been the exact key needed to save the most powerful sovereign in the world. "I did not burn it," she whispered softly, her voice carrying the undeniable, resonant authority of her true lunar magic, I only gave it the warmth it had been denied for centuries. The ice could not survive the truth, Kaelen, and the truth is that you were never a monster." Kaelen leaned forward and pressed a deep, claiming kiss to her lips, sealing the unspoken vows of the morning. When he pulled away, the stoic, authoritative aura of the Alpha King returned, worn by a man now in total control of his immense power. "The court is waiting," he stated flatly, his gaze shifting toward the splintered doors. "Elder Silas Thorne has prepared the obsidian throne for the final rites. The Mercer family is being held in the lower dungeons. It is time to finish what the Moonlight Ring started. The transition from the ruined safety of the royal bedchamber to the cavernous, freezing corridors of Frostspire Castle felt different today. Evangeline did not walk behind the Alpha King like a shadow. She walked directly beside him. Dressed in a pristine gown of deep midnight blue silk and draped in a cape of white winter wolf fur, she kept her fingers tightly entwined with Kaelen's bare left hand. As they descended the grand spiral staircase, the environmental shift was undeniable. The oppressive, biting chill that had defined the winter court was visibly breaking. The thick layers of frost coating the towering obsidian statues of the ancient kings were weeping, steady drops of water echoing rhythmically off the polished stone floors. A literal physical thaw was spreading through the architecture of the fortress. The royal guards lining the corridors dropped entirely to one knee as the couple passed, crossing their heavily scarred forearms over their chests in the deepest military salute. They were not bowing in terror of a feral beast. They were kneeling in genuine reverence for the king who had conquered his madness, and the quiet queen who had delivered him. Evangeline kept her head high, drawing immense physical strength from the heavy, collused pressure of Kaelen's grip as they approached the massive doors of the obsidian hall. The cavernous amphitheater was packed to absolute capacity, yet the atmosphere was devoid of chaotic, terrified whispering. A solemn, heavy silence dominated the vast space. The elite alphas and high-born nobles stood in rigid formation, their eyes fixed on the raised dais. Sunlight streamed through the vaulted, frosted glass ceiling, illuminating the ancient stone altar. Standing beside the altar was Elder Silas Thorne, draped in heavy ceremonial furs, holding the dark velvet cushion. Resting innocently atop the velvet was the Moonlight Ring, its silver surface perfectly calm, waiting for the final ritual. As Kaelen and Evangeline stepped into the light, the entire assembly sank to their knees in a synchronized wave of rich silks. Kaelen led Evangeline up the obsidian steps of the dais, his presence projecting a suffocating authority. He did not sit on his massive throne. Instead, he stood beside it, acting as an impenetrable shield at her back as she faced the kneeling court. "Bring forth the prisoners," Kaelen commanded, his voice a low, echoing rumble that sent a shiver down the spine of every wolf in the room. The heavy side doors groaned open, and the elite guards dragged the Mercer delegation into the light. The contrast was absolutely staggering. Althea Mercer, the flawless jewel who had once demanded the world bow to her beauty, was completely unrecognizable. Stripped of her crimson velvet, she wore the coarse, scratchy grey burlap of a common traitor. Her golden hair was matted, her face hollowed by the crushing psychological weight of her vanity turning to ash. The spiritual frost that had encased her arm was gone, extracted safely by Evangeline the day before, but the limb hung limply, a phantom reminder of the divine rejection she had suffered. Lord and Lady Mercer walked beside her in heavy iron chains, their aristocratic arrogance entirely broken, their eyes darting around the hostile room in pure panic. They were forced to their knees at the base of the dais. Lady Mercer looked up, her gaze locking onto the radiant daughter she had abused, starved, and hidden in the dark cellars for 19 years. "Evangeline," the older woman rasped, her voice cracking as she attempted to project a maternal affection that had never existed. "Evangeline, please. We are your family. You must tell the king to show mercy. We did not know your magic was real." Evangeline stared down at the woman who had struck her with riding crops, the woman who had called her a useless, wolfless defect. The deep, somatic heat of the fated mate bond throbbed against her pulse, reminding her of her absolute worth. She did not feel the crippling fear that had dominated her childhood. She felt only a distant pity for people whose souls were so hopelessly hollow. "You knew exactly what you were doing," Evangeline replied, her voice soft, yet carrying an ethereal resonance that effortlessly reached the farthest corners of the hall. "You built an illusion of perfection on a foundation of cruelty. You thought stripping me of every resource and every shred of dignity would render me weak. You thought confining me to the freezing dark would make me invisible." She took a slow, deliberate step forward, her silk gown pooling around her feet. But the cold did not break me. It only taught me how to survive until the fire found me. Althea looked up, tears streaking through the dirt on her face. "I am your sister," she sobbed, her voice a pathetic wheeze devoid of arrogance. "I was supposed to be the Luna. You stole my destiny." Evangeline's grey eyes shifted, the dormant cosmic magic in her blood flaring briefly into a luminous silver. She looked at Althea, seeing past the dirt to the absolute, unyielding greed that still stained her sister's spirit. "I stole nothing," Evangeline stated simply. "The Moonlight Ring judged your soul, Althea, and it found you entirely empty. You reached for a crown, but you never understood the sacrifice required to bear the weight of a kingdom." Evangeline paused, completely severing the traumatic chains of her past. "Thank you for letting me go," she said, her voice dropping into an absolute finality. "Because being let go had allowed me to be found by a better man, a better kingdom, a better life, and I will never, ever look back." Kaelen stepped forward, his face a mask of cold, unyielding granite. "The judgment of the true Luna is final." The Alpha King rumbled, executing the will of the ancestors with merciless precision. "For the crimes of high treason, the Mercer bloodline is permanently stripped of all titles and wealth. Lord and Lady Mercer, you are sentenced to the deep salt mines of the jagged coast for the remainder of your natural lives. And you, Althea," his intimidating gaze narrowed with terrifying disdain, "you are banished to the outer wastelands. You will walk into the freezing storms without a pack, without a name, and without protection. If you ever set foot within the borders of my territory again, my guards will execute you on sight." Althea let out a blood-curdling shriek of pure, hopeless despair as the heavy iron chains were pulled tight. The elite guards dragged the screaming, sobbing family backward through the center aisle, hauling them out of the obsidian hall and into the unforgiving reality of their permanent exile. The heavy oak doors slammed shut behind them with a hollow boom, officially erasing the Mercer name from the noble registries of the realm forever. With the toxic remnants of the past completely purged, the atmosphere shifted to profound spiritual reverence. Elder Silas Thorne stepped forward, bowing deeply before Evangeline as he offered the dark velvet cushion. "The false claimants have been purged," the ancient elder proclaimed, his voice trembling with the magnitude of the historical moment. "The ancient curses are broken. The beast has been tamed by the light. Now, the ancestors demand the final alignment. Step forward, Evangeline, and claim the divine right of the sovereign." Evangeline took a deep breath, the crisp, pine-scented air filling her lungs. She looked back at Kaelen. The massive Alpha King gave her a slow, deeply encouraging nod, his golden claiming mark visibly glowing beneath the collar of his leather armor, a constant, physical reminder that she was entirely safe. She turned back to the altar and reached out. Her small, calloused fingers hovered over the sacred silver band. The Moonlight Ring, which had brutally rejected Althea with terminal frost, reacted entirely differently to Evangeline's proximity. It hummed. The metal vibrated with a warm, eager sentience, a high-pitched, musical resonance that sang directly to the cosmic magic running through her veins. She gently, reverently pinched the silver band between her fingers, and lifted it from the velvet cushion. It felt impossibly light, yet heavy with the collective memory of 1,000 generations of northern queens. She brought the ring down and slid it smoothly onto her ring finger. The reaction was instantaneous and apocalyptic in its beauty. The moment the sacred silver settled against her skin, the ring detonated in a blinding, explosive wave of brilliant silver moonfire. A shockwave of pure, celestial light erupted from her hand, rushing outward in a massive, visible ring of energy that completely swept through the cavernous obsidian hall. The elite alphas and nobles threw their arms up to shield their eyes from the overwhelming, radiant brilliance. The somatic feedback was staggering. Evangeline felt her veil sight magic fully and permanently integrate with the ancestral power of the kingdom. The silver moonfire did not burn, it healed. As the wave of light crashed through the heavy obsidian pillars and expanded into the architecture of Frostspire Castle, the last lingering shadows of the winter beast curse were completely obliterated. The heavy, magical frost that had plagued the high towers instantly sublimated into glittering, harmless mist. Through the massive stained glass windows, the court witnessed an absolute miracle. The frozen, barren courtyard below was suddenly bursting with life. Resilient white winter blooms and vibrant green vines violently pushed their way up through the cracked stone and permafrost, a spontaneous, magical spring conquering the eternal winter. Evangeline stood at the epicenter of the miracle, her silver silk gown billowing in the residual magical current, her entire being radiating an undeniable, sovereign authority. The ring on her finger glowed with a soft, eternal silver light that perfectly harmonized with the molten gold claiming mark on her wrist. She had endured 19 years of total invisibility, only to become the brightest, most undeniable force in the entire world. Kaelen Sterling, the most feared and powerful warlord in the three realms, stepped down from the dais. He moved with slow, deliberate reverence, walking around the altar to face her. Ignoring the stunned, awestruck stares of his entire kingdom, the Alpha King dropped heavily to both knees before his mate. He bowed his head in absolute, unconditional devotion, pressing his lips gently to the sacred silver band on her finger. The claiming mark on his wrist pulsed with a matching, molten gold warmth against her skin. The entire assembly of elite alphas, commanders and high court nobles immediately followed their king. They did not hesitate. They dropped as one, pressing their foreheads to the cold, polished obsidian floor in total, unified submission. The thawing of the northern territories, Elder, Silas and the historians would recount in hushed, reverent whispers for generations to come, was not a seasonal shift brought by the warming of the sun. It was the result of a profound cosmic realignment. It was the story of a quiet, invisible girl who survived the freezing dark, who claimed a cursed relic with a pure heart, and who ultimately taught the most terrifying beast in the world how to love. Evangeline looked down at the massive, devoted man kneeling at her feet. She felt the steady, rhythmic pulse of their perfectly aligned souls echoing through the space where her fear used to be. A profound healing heat radiated through her veins, and she knew, with absolute certainty, that her kingdom would never, ever be cold again.